Dr. Dushyanthi is obviously incredible. For those that don't know her, haven't had the opportunity to meet her, obviously because of quarantine, but she's absolutely amazing, and she is. She's done all kinds of incredible things, and which I found out just yesterday or this week that she would come in and occasionally teach at Columbia University. She just dropped that in passing. Don't act like I didn't hear that, Dushyanthi. I didn't heard you say that yesterday, which is insane, or 2 days ago. But she's amazing, and just such an amazing and incredible professional in her field. And so we're going to talk about suffering, and we want to talk about the subject of suffering, and obviously the story of Job is incredible. Can we all, some type of visual snap or clap, give it up for Dr. Dushyanthi?
So hello, I am excited to be here. So thank you, Pastor Sam, for having me on here to chat with you guys tonight. Pastor Sam really laid it out really well. We're suffering right now. This is our season of suffering. We've experienced suffering on an individual level. So we've gone to church, we've heard the messages, we've read books, we know how to deal with suffering in our own life. What's been so challenging about this season is that we have to now deal with global suffering. And it is completely overwhelming. And Pastor Sam and I spoke on DNA night about this being a double pandemic. We have COVID, plus we have civil unrest. So we have two major traumas happening at the same time. And we defined trauma that night. The psychological definition is when we feel helpless in an unsafe world. And that's how a lot of us are feeling. We're feeling helpless and we're not feeling safe. So we talked about trauma, we talked about grief, anxiety, all these emotions that were irritable, that were unmotivated. We even talked about post-traumatic stress disorder, where you can get stuck in the trauma and you have flashbacks and nightmares. But tonight I want to talk to you guys about a different phenomenon in psychology. And this is called post-traumatic growth. And the idea in this theory is that after a trauma, our life is somehow elevated. So this is more than just resilience. Psychology always talks about, oh, we develop resilience, we can bounce back. And we know that most of us will bounce back from trauma. But this is something different. This is saying we are going to leave this situation better than when we started it. So in studying this, Job is the perfect book to pull from. So I'm going to talk about this both from a psychology lens, because I'm a therapist, and also from the biblical lens, because I'm a Christian. So when you look at post-traumatic growth, we know that not everybody experiences this growth. Some people don't grow after a trauma. So that's why it's really interesting as a therapist to study and say which people are the people who grow from trauma versus the people who are staying stuck in trauma. So we're going to look at 5 different areas of life where people can grow from trauma, and then the choices we can make to try to grow in those areas through this very difficult season. So the first area that you can grow in post-traumatic growth is as an individual, is you. So you hear people say, oh, I feel so much stronger now that I've gone through that. You know, I'm a better person, I'm a stronger person. So the person that I like to pull from for this is Viktor Frankl. And I'm not sure how many of you know him, but he was a psychiatrist who was in a concentration camp, in a Nazi concentration camp, and he was a prisoner. So he has a very interesting perspective. Now mind you, in this camp, his mother, his father, his brother, and his pregnant wife died. And while he was in this camp, he worked as a psychiatrist, and when I say worked, as in undercover, for the inmates. And when he left, he wrote an amazing book called Man's Search for Meaning, one of my favorite books, and there's so much wisdom in that book. So Viktor Frankl says, everything can be taken from man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. Now, this blew me away because this is a man who's in prison and he's talking about freedom and choice. And his freedom and choice is saying, even as a prisoner, I still can choose my attitude. And psychology really supports this. We're going to talk a lot about DBT tonight. That's dialectical behavioral therapy. And in DBT, they distinguish between pain and suffering. So pain is what we all experience, and it's inevitable. So pain are the bad things that happen to us. But suffering is how we interpret that pain. It's the story we tell ourselves about that pain. So in DBT, we cannot control our pain, but we do have power and choice over our suffering. So for example, pain. I can't go see my family in Miami during COVID. I'm going to use Pastor Sam's example. Suffering. Therefore, I am alone and life is horrible and there's nothing I can do here in California. Right? So we hear the difference. And there's a bit of a lie in the suffering versus this is horrible and I really miss my family, but I'm going to keep in touch with them on Zoom. And as soon as this is over, I'm going to book a flight and I'm going to be there when it's safe. And really being able to keep your mind in that space. So pain. My boyfriend left me. So anyone who has had someone who's left them, we all know how painful that can be. Suffering. No one will ever love me. Right? So do you hear the difference there and how our mind can spin and tell us these stories about the pain that we're experiencing? So there's a lie in the suffering. And what it takes is being really conscious of our thoughts to make sure that we're not telling ourselves any lies about the pain that we're experiencing. So, and there's also an acceptance that needs to happen for what life is giving us. So Viktor Frankl says, it did not really matter what we expected from life, but rather what life expected from us. What is life telling us that we need to do and how we need to grow? So my favorite verse from the book of Job is when he's really down in the dumps. He's really like devastated beyond devastated. And then he says, he has a moment. And Job says, when he has tested me, I will come forth as gold. And he wants to emerge. He wants to emerge like gold, even in the midst of all this tragedy. And that is personal growth. Second area where you see post-traumatic growth is in our relationships. So in difficult times, we know that we have to depend on the people who we love to support us and uplift us. But I think we can all agree that it can also be taxing for our relationships. So we know in COVID, we're having to spend time with people and maybe too much time with some people. We've seen some issues coming up in marriages. We've seen there not being good boundaries. We see, friendships getting strained. We see in this civil unrest, these really difficult conversations happening that are splitting people apart. So we also see this in the book of Job. As Pastor Sam spoke about, there was an issue between him and his friends. His friends were essentially blaming him and saying, well, maybe this happened to you because it's your fault. And I love what Job says to his friends. He says, I've heard all this before. What miserable comforters all of you are. He's like, I'm already hurting. You guys are miserable. Why are you? And you all know, what it's like to have those friends who are trying to say the right thing and they say all the wrong things. Or maybe you've been that friend where you say all the wrong things, even though you are well-intentioned. And what I love is at the end of the book, God affirms to Job, like Pastor Sam said, that it's not because he did anything wrong, but he says to Job's friends, I'm angry with you because he didn't feel that what they said was right. It was not okay to blame Job. And God asked Job to pray for his friends. So if you just sit with that. So when Job was in his lowest point, his friends were not able to support him. And then God's calling on him not only to forgive them, but to pray for them so God will forgive them. And that's a big ask. Do we feel like forgiving these people who are driving us crazy and praying for those people that are hurting us? So there is a choice that Job makes, because he does pray for his friends. And after that, God restores his life. So there's a link in that prayer and his restoration. And we have that choice in our relationships for post-traumatic growth. Do we respond with forgiveness, with prayer, with love? Or do we respond with resentment and anger? The third aspect of post-traumatic growth is life appreciation. So we can all relate to this. What do you miss during COVID? What do you appreciate now that you took for granted before, right? So skin hunger is a big theme that's coming up right now, where people are just missing hugs and handshakes. And it's making people depressed that they can't hug people when they see them. Or just being able to hang out or grab a drink or get on a plane without having to think about it, breathing fresh air without worrying about having to wear a mask, going to the gym. So we have all of that that's already happening. I saw someone asked there we go. Someone asked what number 3 was, and it's about appreciating life. So we're all starting to appreciate life in a different way, but the choice that we can make is to really focus on gratitude. So the research shows that even if once a week you write down the things that you are grateful for, that you are not only happier, but your health is better, more positive health outcomes. And you can write down what you're thankful for from the past, pre-COVID, but you can also look at your life and say, what is God's provision right now? What manna is he raining down from heaven right now? And what can we be thankful for? And can we intentionally set our mind on those things as well? There is another technique in psychology, and it's called savoring the good. So I just want to be clear, and I spoke about this on the last talk, we want to allow space for the negative emotions. This is not about not being able to be bummed out sometimes, because we all are. And in fact, we find that if you suppress that feeling, you'll feel even worse. But we also know that the brain has something called a negativity bias, where we tend to remember bad things over good things. So the bad things stick, and the good things, so they stick almost like Velcro, and the good things, they slide away almost like a nonstick pan, like Teflon. So the reason this happens, psychologists link this to evolutionary theory. So we had to focus in on what was dangerous in the beginning of time. So like an animal that might eat us, because if we were tuned into the negative, dangerous things, then we would survive. So the brain developed that way. So now that we know this, we have to intentionally put more good thoughts into our life. And this is called savoring the good. So that means that if you think about a vacation that you had, the last vacation that you had that felt good. And for me, that was Paris. I had a great time in Paris a year ago around this time. I can just think about Paris, or I could spend 10 seconds really remembering the sights and the sounds and all the scents that I experienced there, and really let those things soak into your mind. Or even if you go on a walk, say you go on a walk tomorrow, and you can just walk and kind of not notice, or take an extra 10 seconds and really notice the colors, the scents, the textures. And this helps balance your brain out. And they find that if you do this daily, that you start feeling better and you start feeling happier. So the Bible verse that I want to bring to this, and one of my favorite verses, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, lovely, admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, meditate on such things. This is from Philippians. So the Bible is also telling us, fix our minds on these things, on these beautiful things, because we know biblically that this is something that we need to do in order to survive and to thrive. The fourth area that we see growth is through new possibilities, because we start evaluating during trauma, what will life look like on the other side of this? What do I want to do when I have freedom? What do I wish I had done that I hadn't done before? Someone just asked, what was the fourth? It's new possibilities, all the new possibilities that could possibly show up in life. So the action step that psychologists recommend is to start envisioning your future. And research shows that if you just write down, this is the best version of myself that I want to be. These are my life goals, that it can start making the brain feel almost as if you're actually achieving them. It puts your brain in a positive state. And this is something that we also see supported in scripture. Write down the vision, right? So for the vision awaits an appointed time, and it will not delay. Wait for it. Though it lingers, it will surely come. It will not delay. So this is a psychological concept, but also a very scriptural concept to keep the vision. And we all have in our heart these promises that we feel God has whispered to us of things that are to come. And the question is when everything is dark and when we're stuck at home, can we still hold on to that promise? Even though nothing is saying that these promises are going to come, can we keep believing that God is going to fulfill these promises? And the last area of growth that we see in post-traumatic growth is in our spirituality. Because when things are difficult, that's when we start questioning God. You know, and Pastor Sam talked about this. Why is this happening? Where is God in this? How long is this going to last? And this is where our choice comes in, because during this time, we have a choice in how much time we spend with him. And whether we're going to lean into him, because it is during these times that he speaks to us the most. But we have to open that door in order to receive what he's trying to tell us, what he's called us to do for that day. We see this in Job, because in Job, he ended up, his big lesson was that he had to surrender to not understanding. Right? And God said to him, like Pastor Sam outlined, he said, you know, who's questioning me? And Job says, I know that you can do anything and no one can stop you. And he said, I questioned you. I was talking about things I knew nothing about, things far too wonderful for me. So God's perspective is not our perspective. And for us to even to try to understand why things are happening, we're always going to fall a little bit short. So part of it is leaning in to hear God. The other part is just surrendering that we're not going to understand, but we can trust that God does. And that's the biggest part of spiritual growth. But that, again, that is an active choice we have to make, to lean into him and to surrender. My personal, so those are the 5 areas. My personal experience with suffering is not something I talk about very often, because I'm a therapist and we have been trained throughout our career not to talk about our own stories. But I felt God pressing me to talk to you guys about it tonight. So I'm going to go through briefly my own experience with suffering and how I learned a lot of these things, aside from learning them through school, but learned them in my own life. So about 10 years ago, I was finishing grad school, and I was also working at the United Nations, and I was doing 2 major projects there. One, I was a media producer, and I was the head producer on a project for Beyonce. And the other project that I was doing is I was writing policy on gender-based violence, so protecting women and men in emergencies from rape, domestic violence, sex trafficking. So these were both things that I felt very passionate about, and I felt like I was doing God's work. And I was 3 months away from graduating, and I was walking down the street in New York City on my way to class, and I got hit with a van. And my world changed. And the most immediate emergency, which we found out in the hospital, is that I was internally bleeding. And I lost consciousness very soon after that. And within pretty shortly after that, I was diagnosed with having a bad concussion or a mild traumatic brain injury. And what this meant is that I was extremely sensitive to light, to sound, to any kind of visual stimulation, to reading. It was very difficult for me to finish school. And I ended up getting about 6 months of extensions. And ultimately I was able to finish, but it was very painful. I was in a lot of physical pain every day. I spent a good amount of the day laying down in bed in a dark room with no stimulation. And I eventually, within a couple months, left my jobs at the UN because I wasn't able to keep up with them. I ended up moving back home and moved with my parents in Connecticut, and I moved into my childhood bedroom. And I spent 2 years there in a dark room with no stimulation. So we're all experiencing quarantine right now. And this was a quarantine where I couldn't do a Zoom call or be on my cell phone or listen to music. And I had also been a singer and a dancer. And all of a sudden all of those things. Even listening to music became painful. Talking on the phone became painful. Reading. And I was literally just in a dark room with ice on my head and asking God, what did I do for this to happen? What was he trying to teach me in this? So I spent a lot of time in prayer. And during those 2 years, I really leaned in, and I think God was sharpening my ability to lean into him and hear him, and also to surrender to him. And after 2 years, I really wasn't much better. I had seen a ton of doctors. I'd been on a ton of medications, but I thought, let me try going back to New York. And I decided to go back into being a therapist again. I had been doing that work before, and now this was the only work that I could do because it was quiet and calming, and it wasn't stimulating like the work I was doing at the UM. Though they had offered me my job back, I turned it down. And I spent another 5 years in New York like this, where I basically would go to the office, I would see a patient, and then I would lay down on the floor because I was in pain for about 45 minutes before I could see the next patient. And then I would, at the end of the day, go back to my apartment, and I would lay in the dark with ice on my head. So basically for a total of about 7 years, I barely left the house. And during that time, I really tried to stay close to God and ask him what he had for me. But I also became very depressed and very anxious and very sad and starting to feel like my life had no meaning. And I started asking God, if this is how my life is going to look, can you please take me to be with you? Because I would rather be with you than have to live a life like this. So as a therapist, I know that that is actually a suicidal thought because you don't have the will to live anymore. And I was having one of those dark nights of the soul when all of a sudden I really felt God's presence strongly with me. And I heard him say, stop saying you want to end your life. Your life is a gift. And I woke up the next morning and I was still in pain. And I was like, maybe I imagined that, because why would God say that and not heal me? And I told my mom, and my mom was thinking about it. And then she that day saw my sister. She told my sister, and my sister showed my mom her bracelet, a bracelet she had just bought that I had never seen. And it said, your life is a gift. So those of us in the spiritual world, we know that that's how God speaks to us, through confirmation, and we hear the same message through different places. So I started to shift, and I started to feel like, okay, God, how do you want me to start seeing even my life like this, where I feel like I'm not much use to anyone or anything? How do you want me to still see in all this suffering that my life is a gift? So we fast forward to 2018. And in 2018, I finally got a diagnosis of having a spinal fluid leak. So there's fluid that goes up and down your spine and brain, and mine was leaking out from the accident because I got hit. And that's why when I would lay down, I would feel better because the fluid wasn't leaking anymore. So that year I had 5 surgeries. And after the 5th surgery, they finally fixed the leak. And all of a sudden, I could get through an entire day without having to lie down. And it was life-changing. And my pain levels were greatly increased. So I would love to tell you that I'm totally healed today, but the truth is that I'm not. And I still deal with a good amount of daily chronic pain. So learning how to thrive and embrace God's grace during suffering is something that is a part of my daily life. But when I look back at that time that I was in the dark room, because I don't have to be in the dark room so much anymore, I see that that was the time that I really heard God the most. And he really fine-tuned my ear to listen to him, or where I learned to surrender to him. When I didn't understand why I was suffering, I learned to just keep giving it over to God and giving it over to God. I see that my understanding of suffering has given me so much compassion for people in pain and people who suffer. And my patients don't know my story, but I have an understanding with them. I can meet them where they're at. I have compassion because I know what it feels like to want to give up and to feel hopeless. And I think back on that message, your life is a gift. And God didn't say to me, your life was a gift when you were working for the UN. Your life will be a gift when you speak to Hillsong one day. He said, your life is a gift right now in the dark, in your suffering. And I think maybe that was really the lesson for me, that suffering was the gift. Because that was the gift where I grew closest to him. It was not an enjoyable process, but that growth, that post-traumatic growth that we talked about, that was God's gift to me during that suffering. So my question for you through all this suffering, can you see in the suffering, not just when it's over, can we see our life as a gift? Paul tells us to rejoice in our suffering. And can you trust that not only is he going to restore you and bless you, but that there's also a divine work being done in you right now? There's a Japanese art of repairing pottery called kintsugi. And I heard about this when I was most injured. And they take the broken pieces of the broken pottery and they fill those cracks with a mix of lacquer and gold. And it becomes a beautiful new art. And those cracks become the most beautiful part of the piece. And the history and the brokenness is what remains with them and becomes a part of who that piece of art is. And I feel that right now the world is having cracks. But can we surrender and can we trust that God is going to fill those cracks with his gold? And he's going to create an even more beautiful version of us, a more beautiful version of his creation than before this all started. I see some snaps.
Wow. That was amazing. Thank you so much for
I'm so glad.
and sharing your story. My goodness, that is. I mean, let the chat speak for itself.
I love the chat. You guys are awesome.
Chat's pretty lit. I mean, I couldn't see the chat when I was talking, but I think it was that. Just kidding. But listen, hey, thank you so much. And listen, guys, can we thank Dushyanthi for that, please? Some type of visual, just so she can see that. But that was amazing, and thank you so much. Thank you, honestly. And I know that was a blessing to so many people on here, and so many people were open enough to say that was for them, and I love that. I think it was such a word in season.